listen, if you've been on the internet for at least more than 2 minutes, and you've probably already heard someone say that a game is the Dark Souls of blank, or when someone is talking about the difficulty of a game, they are probably going to be using Dark Souls as a sort of standard for it. With the way that people be talking about Dark Souls, it feels like something that has existed since the last 20 years. So how the hell is this franchise only from like 2008? What the hell was I doing during that time? Oh, I want to take a look at the Souls series like how I did with the DMC series, see how it's evolved over the years. Only difference is I'll be doing a Souls video every couple of months since, you know, these games are quite long. And as to the question of why didn't I play Demon Souls first? Well, the answer is quite simple. I forgot. If there is something that Dark Souls does quite well is being quiet. The title screen doesn't really have a lot of anything going on in the sound and graphics department. It's desolate, and in some ways I think that it fits the game just fine. Not long after you find yourself in the character creator, which, dear god! You know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the beholder says that I hope Dark Souls 2 looks better. Here's the part where I will talk about the story. How's the story? Well, I ain't gonna ignore what the sign has to say, so I guess that I'm just gonna have to touch upon the story later on in the video. Throughout Dark Souls, you will be exploring the kingdom of Lordran as you try to do something, I guess. In the beginning of the game, it states that a lot of people, especially those who are connected to the flames, like the player, look for glory and treasure and whatever. But that ain't really going to happen when the world is kind of dead. Time hasn't been kind to the once great kingdom, and anything that used to be here is now thirsting for violence. And you're looking mighty lonely over there, you might want to be careful. When I said that the title screen being quiet reflected the game in some ways, this was what I meant. The game by all means has you explore a world almost entirely by yourself. Rarely do you come across NPCs, and when you do happen to meet them, there's a good chance that unless you do something for them or help them out in some occasions, they'll come back as just another enemy for you to kill. There's some guys that will tell you of certain objectives, but they only tell you up to that objective and not much else, leaving you with no real guide for your next task or even where to go. Dark Souls is not an open world, but its world is definitely open-ended. There's a bunch of areas that the player can get lost in and spend a lot of hours in should they please, or at the same time they could just as easily ignore those areas and head straight to the points of interest that'll help them get to the final boss earlier. Since I went straight for the main content, obviously there was a lot of content that I missed. How much? Well, about 30 to 50 extra hours of content. Did I even play the game correctly at that point? Hell, that ain't even counting the DLC. A lot of these areas are incredibly large. Very rarely does it feel like an area is lesser. Except for when the areas are bad, the Tomb of Giants and Blighttown, you are not safe from this discussion. What I do have to say is that regardless of the area, the game is honestly beautiful. The character creator was a horrible first impression though. The art direction in this game is stunning. The dark medieval style is what really brings this game to life, and my god, what a world that was designed here. The game tells you nothing because it doesn't need to. It has everything to show you, from the desolate towns and castles and burning buildings and sunken places. You can definitely see what was once a great civilization here that is now nearly reduced to nothing, and it results in a weird sense of horror and awe as you explore and discover what Dark Souls has to offer. Exploration is by far one of its best aspects, even when you're ignoring half the content like yours truly. This is also one of the best and few examples in which I think that the graphics of the game do affect the overall game, as without them I genuinely don't think that Dark Souls would have been what it is. The world wouldn't be the horrific yet wonderful decaying kingdom that it is, and the bosses and the game as a whole wouldn't feel like the insurmountable task that it gained a reputation for being. Here it is, the main talking point, the very difficult gameplay from the Dark Souls games. The formula of Dark Souls 1 is pretty simple, honestly. You just go to the area, get lost for a bit, die, find your way around the area, die, find a bonfire, die, make your way to the boss and die like 5 more times. Repeat for tens of hours and you got yourself a Dark Souls. The controls are also not that difficult. A lot of the things need certain stats to be used, and to increase the stats and level up you need to get souls by killing enemies. And if the enemies kill you, then you will lose all your souls. When asked the question of whether or not the game of Dark Souls is difficult, then I will have to say that it is. but in many different ways to what the latest entries have become. If I had to describe it, the challenge in Elden Ring came mostly from the actual enemies and bosses, but in Dark Souls, to me, the challenge more so came from the environment and finding the best way to traverse the lands. When exploring in Dark Souls, the enemies were very manageable, however it was very easy to be overwhelmed when the area came into play. Sometimes it was possible for me to get cornered and bashed to death, while other times my carelessness caused me to fall way too many times in Blighttown. Despite all of that, exploring the areas is still a very fun task. Discovering how the many places connect with each other and how that can help streamlining travel is a feeling like no other. There is a sense of discovery in this game that feels quite unlike most other games I've played. It rivals the feeling of a Metroidvania more than that of other AAA action-adventure/RPGs games of its time. Now, I do have to say that not all of the areas felt entirely perfect, because god damn, some of these areas are easily some big pains in the ass. A lot of people like to describe criticism of hard games with get good, but I feel like there's a fine line between the get good and just straight up bullshit, and Dark Souls is constantly living on that edge. A lot of areas have very difficult parts to them. The enemies can corner you, the hazards can surprise you, and you can very easily fall and die. However, for the most part, that still manages to feel like it's your fault. Many of the hazards are telegraphed and displayed in plain sight for those with an attentive eye, just as how many enemies can easily be avoided if you simply learn their patterns and learn how to deal with them individually. Undead Burg, Undead Parish, Anor Londo, the Archives, Crystal Caves, and some parts the sewers were all very manageable areas that follow the standards that I just said, with areas like the Lost Isolith, the Tomb of the Giants, and Blighttown being some of the worst areas in the game. The Tomb of the Giants poses the question of what would happen if you locked the two items that made this area manageable to explore behind an enemy drop and then says, no, you can still get the lantern to illuminate your path by exploring deeper into the Tomb of the Giants.
Hey, hi, I'm Barry, bro. Can I get some money?
Yeah, just pay us $15. Lost Isolith has the problem of just being annoying by having to walk across the lava and just tank the damage, but Blighttown is like the two of them combined with all of the worst aspects of each other. My god! I can barely see what I'm doing on Blighttown, I constantly get lost, I die falling off of what doesn't look lethal, and when it's not altitude problems, it's just attitude problems. This level is too toxic for me, I can't handle it. But when you finally make it to the end of the journey through the mini hells you just were into, you get a random monster trying to have you for dinner or something, damn! The bosses are intimidating, bombastic, and some of the few times in which music will be playing in the levels, which not only highlighted the quiet nature of the game, but also highlighted the bosses that much more. I think that alongside exploration, these are easily the best part of the game, although when compared to the later entries in the series, I did find the bosses slightly easier in this game. It's kind of the same philosophy with the difficulty, in which the challenge was from being aware of the surroundings and less so of the actual enemy. Bosses like the Gaping Dragon, Seath the Scaleless, and the Gargoyles are the perfect example of that. I don't think that this philosophy is necessarily inferior, it's just that when it comes to Souls and more so just difficult games, I generally tend to prefer bosses being the pinnacle of the difficulty. However, that doesn't really take away from the difficulty in this game, it's just a matter of preference and playstyle, I suppose. Very few bosses in Souls 1 were actually bad. At first I didn't like Ornstein and Samo, but when I looked back on the boss I thought, damn, those were some pretty smartly designed bosses. And now that I am writing the script, I can safely say that they may just be some of the best bosses in the entire game. They feel like the definitive version of the philosophy of this game. Their boss essentially demands you interact with the environment while also paying attention to what Asterisk and Obelisk over there are doing. There are also some pretty dumb bosses that I don't like that damn goat man was easily like nearly the hardest boss in the game. I'm not fucking kidding, he was as difficult as Ornstein and Samo, it's ridiculous. His arena is stupidly small, there's dogs helping him, and the dogs are like half the challenge. Dogs are somehow always the worst enemies in Souls games, it's unbelievable. Nito and his lackeys were also a pain, the Fire Demon is a reskin and I didn't really care much about him, and Seath the Scaleless was pretty damn easy if we're not counting all the tries it took me to get the sword that I couldn't use because it was a magic sword. There is a lot of replayability in Dark Souls. You can choose many different classes all with their own benefits and disadvantages. I just decided to go with the safe option since I didn't want to regret my options too late into the playthrough, and thankfully I had a lot of fun with the basic class. I had some nice armor, and once I found the Great Axe and Dragon King Great Axe, that shit was easy. I imagine that the purpose was to make the game as replayable as possible. Maybe get to the point in which you can explore this world without any complications, because as of now this game is extremely hard for me to navigate. I get lost more often than I don't. After hearing me ramble on for a while, I'm sure you can guess that I believe that Dark Souls is a really good game, and you'd be correct, I think that the game even today is fantastic. However, something else that I want to talk about is how well the storytelling is handled in this game, and why I believe that Souls games do storytelling better than most of the media. Listen, I love video games. I love when they tell me stories. I haven't played the demo of Final Fantasy 16, I think that is pretty good. However, I feel like a lot of the time the games don't really take full advantage of how they could tell the stories in the medium. Games are not held back by the limitations of movies, TV, books, whatever industry, and I feel like Dark Souls takes complete advantage of the medium by choosing to tell its story in such an out-of-the-ordinary way. You have to go out of your way to find and understand the story of Dark Souls. You have to interact with the world in order to understand the story of Dark Souls, and because of that, the game manages to make the player feel engrossed in the world and make them feel as though they themselves are a part of it. You're not being told anything, you're simply another character inside of the world, and so few games actually manage to convey that feeling properly. It simply makes you feel like part of something greater when in other games you are something greater. It is a weird way of telling a story, sure, but it works, and it has hooked many players into the game for a reason. My favorite example of storytelling in a Souls game, so far at least, is the final boss, Gwyn the Lord of Cinders. Spoilers ahead, I guess. Throughout the entire game, we are shown that this world, like a flame, is slowly fading, and many sacrifices had to be done to keep the world standing as it is, and throughout the entire game, Gwyn is built up like no other boss. He's supposed to be like one of the most fearsome bosses, the most fearsome boss. You saw him in the intro cutscene, damn it. Throughout the entire game, you're just thinking to yourself, he's like one of the creators of the world, so his fight must be bombastic, epic. He must be like the final boss to beat all the bosses in this game. And so you make your way through the game, defeat and obtain the Lord Souls, and eventually go down into the kiln of the first flame, where everything began. A desolate place that has clearly seen better days, and as you make your way to the dilapidated building, you keep raising your expectations as to what Gwyn could be, until finally you get to the end of the road, and enter the fog one last time. When you see Gwyn, it's like reality comes crashing down straight to your face. The boss that was hyped up so much is now nothing but a shell. No better than you, no better than a normal hollow. He's lost his mind, and in fact he may just be lesser than any other enemy you found in the game. There's no cinematic to introduce him, there's not even a second face. All you're left with is Gwyn and the piano. In an attempt to keep the world from going back to the edge of darkness, Gwyn sacrificed himself. His own soul was burnt to keep the fire lit. The piano that plays is like a lament for how things have ended. It is not a wall-breaking final piece like how many were expecting, but I would argue that in the case of the game, this might just be the better option. A melancholic piece to close the curtains on this fantastic experience. Dark Souls is an incredibly refreshing game to play. It is unlike anything the industry has done before, and it still manages to set itself apart over 10 years after its release. Even when comparing it to games that have succeeded it has a beautiful world to explore, many secrets to uncover, and replayability that could have me playing this game multiple times over in the next couple of years. This game is indeed fantastic. Well, that's all the time that I've had for today. I'm just a random stranger you met on the internet, but hey, just call me Pseudo.